Hello, everyone, and welcome to this evening's discussion on the impact of the SEC position on cybersecurity for the CISO. My name is Joel Caminer. I'm a senior director here at the New York University Center for Cybersecurity, which is our interdisciplinary research center where we bring together faculty from all across the school, our Tandon School of Engineering, our NYU Law, and other schools to really debate and discuss the most relevant topics in cybersecurity. Tonight, really, we've got a fun and really timely topic to dig into, which is some of the recent SEC activity in cybersecurity. And in particular, I think we have two topics that we're hoping to explore a little bit more tonight. The first is the recent enforcement action against SolarWinds, and there's in particular the direct enforcement action against their CISO, Tim Brown. But we also, related to that, want to dive into and understand a little bit better the new SEC cybersecurity rules, sometimes called the new SEC disclosure rules, which are requiring reports of cybersecurity incidents 4 days after the determination of materiality. And I'll let our expert panel get into how one determines materiality. But that new rule takes effect very soon, coming up on December 18th for large public companies. So a lot to unpack in that. I'm joined tonight by really three wonderful experts and speakers on all things cyber, who will dive into this topic in a lot more detail. Real quickly, I'll just do some introductions. First, Randy Milch. Randy is the co-chair of the NYU Center for Cybersecurity, a distinguished fellow at the Reese Center on Law and Security, and a professor of practice at the NYU School of Law. He serves as the faculty co-director of the MS in Cybersecurity Risk and Strategy program. And prior to coming to NYU, Randy was the general counsel and head of public policy at Verizon Communications. Welcome, Randy.
Thanks, Joel.
Next, we have Ed Amoroso, who perhaps has too many titles to read off all at once, but for the sake of tonight's conversation, Ed is the CEO of TAG Cyber, a global cybersecurity advisory, training, consulting, and media services company, supporting hundreds of major organizations across the world. Ed is also a distinguished research professor in computer science and engineering here at NYU Tandon, serving on the faculty in the Cybersecurity Risk and Strategy MS program, our CISO Executive Certificate program, and several others. Ed retired from AT&T after 31 years of service, beginning in Unix security R&D at Bell Labs and culminating as Senior Vice President and Chief Security Officer at AT&T. Thanks for joining, Ed. And Joe Sullivan, who currently is the CEO of Ukraine Friends, but also, and president of Joe Sullivan Security, LLC. Joe is also the former chief security officer at Cloudflare, Facebook, and perhaps most famously, Uber. He's held senior security and legal roles at eBay, PayPal, and also brings a really unique dimension to the conversation tonight as a former federal prosecutor. So with that, I'm going to hand the mic over to Randy Milch to really sort of set the foundation for some of the new SEC enforcement actions and the disclosure rules and sort of get us all up to speed on the latest activity. Randy?
Thanks, Joel, and thanks, Joel and Ed and Joe for putting all this all together. It's very timely. So the first thing we're going to talk about is the SEC action against SolarWinds and its Chief Information Security Officer, Mr. Brown. This is a federal court action. This is somewhat unusual. It's in the sense that most of these are administrative proceedings from the SEC, which also tend to settle. But this clearly did not settle, and the SEC went ahead and filed this fraud action in federal court in the Southern District of New York. And basically, the idea is, and this is condensing a 200-paragraph complaint into something that's a little bit more digestible.
Thank you for that, by the way.
Longer doesn't mean it's stronger, but it's certainly long. Basically, the idea is that SolarWinds and Brown because of statements that were made basically from the time of SolarWinds IPO in 2018 until its actually third statement about the Sunburst hack in early 21. Had issued basically a set of statements in 2018 about the security practices that they would undertake. This was in the so-called security statement that Mr. Brown put out. And then in their initial filings to register themselves as a security when they became public again, they had risk factors. They had a series of risk factors that we're all familiar with, and one of them was about cybersecurity. The gravamen of the complaint is that even beginning at the time of the security statement, but certainly thereafter, statements that were made about the processes, the procedures, things like password management, access control, whether SolarWinds followed a secure development lifecycle, whether SolarWinds had followed the NIST framework or not, that there were significant deficiencies in following these processes. The actual practices deviated at times from what was in the statement, and that the risk factors, and particularly about being vulnerable, the vulnerabilities aspect of it, were insufficient when compared to practice, and certainly from the SEC's allegations as time went on. The SEC pointed to new facts that came about and repeatedly suggest that Brown and SolarWinds should have updated its risk factors. It didn't update the risk factors through that sort of 2.5-year period. In some fashion, and that's going to be something interesting I think we ought to talk about, in some fashion should have updated its risk factors to make it known to investors that the actual cybersecurity practices at SolarWinds, as alleged here, deviated from the processes and procedures that had been set out. There's a little bit more. There's allegations about what happened after the hack. There's about the initial reaction to it. There's allegations about some additional blog posts that Mr. Brown made. But the gravamen of it is that this was fraud on the investing public, because a reasonable investor would have wanted to know that that they didn't follow the NIST framework in its entirety, or that access control was not was weak in as stated here. And so that is the basic complaint that has been filed. As I said, it's a little unusual, and I'd be interested in Joe's view on this, but generally these things settle, and the failure to settle here indicates that SolarWinds was not interested in what the SEC wanted from them in order to settle. And in particular, I think, given the fact that they're going personally against Mr. Brown, SolarWinds was not eager to throw Mr. Brown under the bus. They were going to support him, and they've continued to support him. So I think that in part is what has driven the wedge here, and how we end up in a federal lawsuit. And so there's questions about what how far the SEC has pushed its rules and its precedents. There's questions about whether they're trying to substantively regulate cybersecurity for a non-financial company where they don't really have direct regulatory control. And fundamentally, there's a question about if you have to disclose the status of your vulnerabilities, first, how do you do it in a way that is meaningful but doesn't give the bad guys a great roadmap? And secondly, everybody's going to do it because everybody's got vulnerabilities. So discuss. All you pros now have to discuss this.
Joe, you want to take the first crack?
Yeah. So it's I don't sit in the CISO or CISO role any longer, but I do spend a lot of time talking with security executives, and in fact, I led a 2-hour kind of Chatham House rule conversation today with 25 CISOs. We literally talked for 2 hours today about this case, and I got to hear what a lot of CISOs are really thinking. And I've been hearing the same things over the preceding weeks. And I've talked to Tim at SolarWinds about the case. And so I would say that the security leadership community is shaking in their shoes. They feel completely misunderstood, uh, both in terms of um, the SEC's expectations of them. They feel like, and their ability to have influence and actually get stuff done. The reality for them as security leaders is that they don't get an unlimited budget, they don't get an unlimited team, and even when they raise issues, they and it's a risk debate that often goes above the security executive for a decision. So they're not the ultimate decider on everything security inside their organization. Lots of them don't even own all the different aspects of security, and they definitely don't own the implementation of everything. Some of them are very much auditors, others have engineering teams, but they're all over the place in terms of who they report to, how big their teams are, what percentage of company expense goes to them, how much of a strong voice they have in leadership. So that's the first part. They're petrified. The second part is they don't understand this expectation that they're supposed to be the reviewer of content coming out of their company. Like CISOs have talked for years about how it's not their job to decide whether something is a quote unquote data breach. It's their job to investigate. They're operational leaders. They investigate and respond to incidents, but it's someone else who decides whether the company's transparent and how transparent and where they're transparent. And so they're panicking and thinking that they need to start reading every single thing that their company says about security. They're like, where are all the things that my company is saying about security? Now, I understand in Tim's case that the SEC is alleging that he specifically personally wrote some of the content, and that was it sounds like that was in 2018. So often, we're talking about things that happened 5 years ago, and it'll probably be 6 or 7 years by the time this thing works its way through court. And the last thing I would say is that the SEC referenced a lot of internal texting between security team members. Every single CISO believes that their teams have exactly the same type of internal conversations, because who do you hire for your security team? You hire people who want perfection, who are going to fight hard to champion perfection and improve security inside their company, and their job is to find issues and try and get them fixed. And so they kind of have it's the natural kind of tendency of security team members to be like, the sky is falling all the time, we need more resources, this company's, you know what I mean? And they're just one of the questions they asked me today that we talked about was, do I need to tell my team to stop talking about security? And we all agreed, no, absolutely not. We want to have those kinds of conversations. That's the healthy direction. And it's scary that can be used against them.
That's such a wonderful perspective. Randy and Joe, really good observations and very clear thinking. Joel, I've been nervous for years that there is a paradox in our industry that probably only Joe, Randy, you, me, and people like us know, but anybody even 2 steps away from us may not get. And here's the paradox. I think all of us would agree to the truth of the following statement. If a nation state's coming after you or just a really capable actor, they're going to get you. And Randy and I both work for really big companies with really big budgets and really big teams. And I would have said it then and I would say it now. That's a weird statement, because what the implication is that if someone out there wants to get you, they're going to get you. Now, the reason there's a paradox is because I think implicit in much of what we hear from the government is, hey, clean up your act and make sure nobody's getting in. I mean, that's a very logical thing. The paradox is we work so hard to try to do that, knowing full well that at least right now, you really can't. So life becomes this weird, version of that game. You know that joke where the two guys are in the woods and the leopard's coming, and the guy puts his sneakers on, and he outrun a leopard. He goes, I just need to outrun you. Cybersecurity is sort of that. It's like try and keep your house in order and just kind of, it's going to sound terrible, just kind of hope that nobody has it really in for you, because if they do, they're going to get you. Now, here's the other paradox. This is for the SEC. And I had quite a few collisions the last few weeks on social media as I was saying things I thought were utterly obvious, but maybe some people don't agree. And it's this. Here's my message to all investors, particularly investors in cybersecurity companies. Everybody is in some stage of either having been hacked or being hacked right now. Mueller said that. Remember Robert Mueller on the big stage? Hey, every company, you know the joke we make. The two kinds of companies, ones that know they've been hacked and ones that have been hacked but don't know it. There's all kinds of versions of that joke. But what it extrapolates to is like former directors of the FBI stating on the record, everybody's being hacked, which just further sort of drives home this idea that investors should factor that in and just recognize that there are vulnerabilities in a company like SolarWinds. And there's name a cybersecurity company. I won't put any on the spot, but pick one. I'm pretty sure they're not following NIST. I'm pretty sure Joe or myself could go in there with our little team and find 1,000 things that are wrong. And that's true everywhere. So it's sort of like, hey, investors, this is the great leveler. We're all in this state of problematic sort of posture in terms of cyber. We're working as hard as we can. And I don't think there's a CISO on the planet that is just sitting there negligent saying, I'm not doing my job. I'm going to be negligent. Who needs to be stopping cyber attacks? That's just not the case. And I think in some of these rulings and some of the language that I read, Randy, you're so much better at reading the language than me, but I think there's this implicit belief that like Joe really knows how to do the security. He just chooses not to. Or Ed, you really know how to do this. I just need to really give you a kick in the butt and then you'll do it. And that's just so not the situation. Like we don't knowingly approach this discipline we devoted our lives to at half-mast. Nobody's doing that. It's just not how we do it. We're trying as hard as we can. I get up early in the morning, I work till late at night devoted to this discipline, and still I'm willing to go on social media and say the offense pretty much can win. If they decide they're coming at you, they're going to get you. So the joke here is the perverse conclusion to some of this, and Randy, you alluded to this, is if everybody just reports all the time, like just work in 8K into your workflow, do it with your insurance company. Anytime you get a little inkling, a couple of Sev ones that look a little scary, push a button, workflow generates the 8K, boom, it goes out there and you just DDoS the SEC. It's a perverse, ridiculous thing, but it seems like the incentive is along those lines. Randy, I don't know what you think, but it just seems like it's incenting us to just report everything always, and then the whole thing just degrades to not much entropy in any given report. That's my view.
I think you're definitely onto something. There's an old way of looking at venereal disease. If everyone's got it, it's not too much of a stigma anymore.
Thank you for introducing venereal disease to our discussion.
I didn't think we were going to cover that tonight. Yeah.
Around dinner time too, so thanks. That's really good.
We don't know when people are going to watch this. But I think there's one important point here. In addition to what you've said, which I agree with, that I agree 100% that this disclosure regime has always been a bit bizarre to me. because on the one hand, what are you going to say that's meaningful to an educated investor, if there is one out there, that also is not incredibly meaningful to your antagonist, right? So there's this desire for protection, for perfection in the disclosure that seems bizarre. But take this one step further. The SEC was very clear in this complaint that if Sunburst had never happened, they would have regarded both SolarWinds and Mr. Brown as already already committing fraud. So he didn't need to get to the hack, right? Their comparison is between the stated desire in the security statement to follow NIST, the stated desire to have strong passwords, the stated desire to have least access, regime, and failing to do that. And then you're supposed to disclose something about your failure to meet your stated goals. And this is where I think this is a big expansion, right? We have seen the SEC go after folks who have internal processes, whose risks are too hypothetical, they would say. And there have been 4 or 5 actions by the SEC. All were administrative and all is settled. When you actually had a breach, right? They were actual breaches and there were failures associated with the breach. This takes it back a big step. The notion that you're supposed to generate some sort of meaningful disclosure about your failure to your failure to have strong passwords everywhere is sort of ludicrous, right? I don't even know what you would say. I mean, if you were to do that, and as the lawyer who used to help craft these disclosures, I don't know what I would say to my CISO. And when we sort of said, well, what can I say about this? And they would look at me and say, I don't know, Randy, this is your problem. This is not my problem. Exactly what you said, Ed. And I mean, I don't know. That's what I think. I think you're absolutely right. But this goes a step further because we're in the vulnerability realm. We're in the risk realm. We're not in the you've been hacked realm. I guess you wouldn't say everyone's in the process of being hacked, but there seems to be an event at a certain point. This is all in the precursor stage.
Randy, one of the questions that kept coming up with the group of CISOs was since you have the experience of kind of crafting these things, is there going to be a tension between what the legal department and the company wants to say versus what the security leader wants to say? Because the security leaders are thinking right now, we want to be really, really transparent and paint a very dire picture. They're also worried that their lawyers will say no, because every time we file one of these, someone's just going to sue us. Like the plaintiff's lawyers are just going to have an automatic, like, oh, you just said your security's not good, and now we're going to sue you. So like they're worried about all of these things, and now they're trying to figure out how active do they, as operational professionals, need to be in micromanaging the disclosure statements that the lawyers are going to write, and is there going to be a tension there?
I don't see how there's not going to be a tension. As a general matter, you generate these risk statements, and then it's an iterative process generally, right? You're going to the experts in your company to make sure that they ring true, that you haven't missed anything, that you're not overstating something. If you go look at the SolarWinds risk statement that they put out in 2018 and didn't materially change, it seems pretty comprehensive. It says pretty much, we're in a risky business. We're gonna try. We may not be successful. We may not have the resources. It's going to be expensive. I mean, they say all these things, right? And if we have a breach, it's going to be horrific, is what they basically say. And the SEC will say, well, you said if, and that leads people astray, like you haven't done it, right? I think there will be. I think that is a huge two things are true. One, it's a huge waste of time if your chief information security officer is spending more than a nanosecond worried about SEC disclosure. That is not their job. It's not what they should be worried about. They should, I would think it's good governance to run it by them and good practice to make sure that it's comprehensive. If there's some aspect you've missed, you want to put it in there at a high level. So I think one, that would be a huge waste of their time. And number two, there will be a lawsuit, right? There's always a lawsuit. There's someone who writes on Bloomberg who has said very clearly that everything is securities fraud now. If your stock goes down a tick, it's because of securities fraud. And I think there may just have to be this wave. I mean, I personally would be very supportive, Ed, of absolutely dire disclosures, because if everyone does it, then there won't be an appreciable diminution of your stock vis-a-vis your competitors, right? If everyone says, you know, we're all a work in progress here, God isn't finished with us, and that was really true about cybersecurity, you know, I think you would have to, if your stock goes down, there'll be a securities case. You may get an FTC knocking at your door because you've just admitted that you don't have reasonable cybersecurity practices, perhaps. A lot of this comes through with the second guessing that's going on. You know, if you take Ed's point, which I do take, and I believe fundamentally that these are hardworking professionals trying to do their best. There's no cordon of immunity, right? It can't be that if you fail at this unenviable task in any sense, failure there being you want to do A, but you're doing A prime because you've got 20,000 people to herd and you've got complicated code and it's legacy and how much, which Sev 1 are you going to do today? Are you ever going to get to the Sev 2s, right? Or 3s or 4s? One of those could be your Achilles heel, right? It's the one you don't, it's always the one you don't fix.
The thing we've been coaching to CISO teams, consistent with what Joe had said, is pre-planned language and automated workflow. Let me tell you what I mean by that. When your kids play those dumb Mad Libs games where you write out a sentence and there's a line there, and then you pick little cards and you put it in, it makes a funny sentence. You just fill in the blanks with a template. I think what's going to happen, because like Joe and I would say, every cybersecurity problem breach breaks down to, I don't know, 20 or 30 things. MITRE ATT&CK would say 200, but you can group them. What are the columns in MITRE ATT&CK's 10 things, whatever. So you could probably write with your lawyers 10 Mad Lib sentences where you just leave out something. And then when there's a problem in workflow, I say it should all be automated. Like, my belief is this screams workflow automation, because if I need something dependable in real time, 4 days could be, it happens on Thursday, my daughter's getting married Friday, we have family over Saturday and Sunday, and oh my God, Aunt Gladys, who's 100, passed away on Sunday, we've got a blah, 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 blah. The attack could happen there, and I could be a public company that makes shoes, and suddenly there was an attack, and what, I'm negligent? So it screams workflow. If you're telling me it has to be real time, the only thing I've ever been able to depend on in my whole career of doing this 40 years is automation. You can't depend on people or process or manual. It just breaks down. So I've been just saying the incentive here is to pre-plan a bunch of different notifications. That's what an 8K is, but I'm just talking about the specifics of the incident. Get those worked out with your lawyers. And then from the SOC all the way through GRC, through your whole team, embed the workflow. When there's something going on, there should be automation that involves the lawyers. Workflow, I think the insurance company should be involved as well. It should just happen, and boom, it gets shipped off to the SEC. I know they don't want that, but I think that if they get 10,000 a day, maybe they'll rethink this. But that is the incentive. If we're all good at doing automation, we could totally do that. And then suddenly, investors, to your point, Randy, it's this weird DDoSing of everything. And suddenly nothing makes sense. If If there's nothing, if you got a herd of elephants, then I can't find the one elephant I'm looking for. So I think the herd of elephants is probably, in my mind, the direction I'd be counseling teams to go, because automation workflow keeps me out of trouble. Pre-planned notification, Randy, that stuff I'm sure you were counseling when you were over at Verizon, right? Plan the notifications in advance, figure out what you're going to say, categorize them by event, get them pre-approved, know what we're doing. Don't do that in the scramble of the moment. And when there's an issue, we fit into the pre-planned notification what happened. I'm just saying automate it. And then the CISO can just do their job, right? I mean, is that a crazy idea? Seems like you could do that so easily. ServiceNow would be a good platform for doing that. I think you could do that in a month's worth of configuration and programming with a good ServiceNow hacker. I think I could get that thing working.
Yeah. I wanted to take it back a little bit, maybe a little bit away from the legal and the disclosure aspect. No offense, Randy. But Joe, you were talking earlier about talking to CISOs and sort of what they're feeling right now. And I sort of read what the SEC was claiming they were not truthful about. And it's sort of a joke as those of us who have been in the role, we're all going to say, yes, we're running vulnerability management programs and we're running all these other security aspects. And none of us would say that they are 100% foolproof, not subject to any sort of operational breakdowns or anything like that. We can't, it's a risk management discipline. It's not a zero-sum game. And I know many CISOs who have had to explain that even to their boards of directors, that I can't guarantee you certain things won't happen. It's a risk management conversation. And so to the CISOs that are sitting there, not just trying to figure out disclosures and their own personal risk now, but they still have to manage their staffs and manage a security program. And I'm wondering how they're thinking about communicating and managing and dealing with all the operational aspects that sit in an enterprise security program.
Well, one thing that they're all doing right now is they're using this case as an opportunity to have a conversation with the entire exec team at the company.
Yeah.
This is a rare opportunity for security leaders to actually try and get more resources, and but they're worried because they feel like the SEC has picked on one officer. They called Tim Brown an officer. I don't know if he's an officer or not. I always thought that was kind of like a term of art. And it's
maybe we should change our titles. We shouldn't be
Yeah,
CISO anymore,
right? Company officer means something. It
right,
means on behalf of the company. There is a very clear delineation between officer and not.
And
we don't know what the way SolarWinds had him though, right? He was a VP.
Let's assume he is. But Joe and I have talked about this before. He's right. Everybody's going for more resources. But here's the problem. I think the majority of CISOs that I interact with are kind of gearheads. I'm not saying that they're just tech nerds, but gearheads in the sense that they're not trained to be a general purpose executive. That's not why you go into this. Maybe this shifts things. Maybe you do get a general purpose risk executive who becomes the CISO's boss. I don't hate that. And I'll bet 99% of CISOs would say, I would welcome it. Please bring someone in to do risk for pandemic and AI and whatever, do that. But for CISOs, they're not equipped to do it. It's like Joe said, the teams that I've always been around, the texts are always holy curse word, and then you name 50 things that are complete. Call the CEO and say they need to fix this tomorrow, not realizing that the CEO has to do the calculus of about 100 factors. And there might be things way more urgent than fixing some vulnerabilities in legacy routers somewhere. To me, I can't sleep at night. The CEO's got bigger fish to fry. So I don't like the idea that when people go, well, Ed, like this is what I got on social media. Ed, you big jerk. You've been saying you want more resources. Look, this is good. Take advantage of it. Move up into the C-suite. And I would say, I don't think most of us want to be there. We want to do our job. We're not trying to be sitting across from the CEO doing strategy for the corporation. That's not why people do this. Maybe in the future, yes, but right now, not in a million years. And you know that's not why Tim Brown does what he does. Was a network security guy. So it's just perverse. The whole thing's crazy in my mind.
You're exactly right. I said at the beginning that CISOs feel misunderstood. The reality of the CISO profession is that it barely existed 20 years ago. Ed and I, we were like,
We were early ones.
most of the people didn't have a title, didn't sit in an exec room. Most of them, when they got into the role or they started in this profession and started moving to the top, the ceiling was at a very different place. It was somewhere around director of IT level at best. And so it was like the people who are at the top of the profession right now, when they got in, they thought the top was a very different place. And if we did a survey of 100 CISOs, we'd find probably 100 different backgrounds in terms of technical capabilities, types of schooling, degrees.
Yeah.
We're just who they report to, what type of resources they get. Like if you go into any of the CISO Slack groups that I'm in, it's all like all of these things are still being like CISOs love to talk about where should we report because some of them are buried and some of them report to the CEO, and it's so all over the place. Resourcing is so all over the place. It's not like if we stopped one of our CFO friends and said, "Hey, my kid wants to be a CFO someday," they'd say, I want them to go major in this. I want them to go intern in that. I want them to go apprentice in this. I want them to have these 7 things, and then they'll be ready to be a CFO. And they know starting their career exactly what they're aiming for, reporting to the CEO of a public company, managing that. There is not a CISO in the world right now who got that guidance and aimed that high. But that's the reality is there a bunch of people who were aiming lower are all of a sudden on a very different, very hot seat.
Yeah, we call those tribes. You could come up from government, you could come from compliance, you could come from audit, you could come from tech, you could come from development, you can come from any number of things. And these are all very different tendencies. Think about the difference between somebody who was doing internal audit and slid over into the job versus some hacker who was really good at pen testing, got promoted, and still wearing sneakers to work every day, and suddenly you're the CISO. Completely different backgrounds. Those two people can barely have a conversation together, and they have the same title. In fact, if they have a conversation, they'd probably be arguing.
I ran a mentoring program for CISOs a couple of years ago that was the goal of the mentoring program was to teach CISOs business because most of them didn't know how to read a P&L or understand like that. It was just all foreign to them. And all of a sudden they're getting pushed into these exec rooms with the CEOs and everybody and the board and expected to be able to keep up. And they've, like you said, they've lived over in a technical or audit corner of the company. And now all of a sudden they have a lot more attention and a language they don't speak.
Joel, we probably had to bring some folks over from Stern to help us with our master's program. Maybe Randy, you and Joel are the bosses. Why don't you guys get a little bit of Stern influence into our program? Probably be a good idea. Maybe 1 or 2 lectures on basic corporate finance. Probably be a good idea.
I think at the same time, it'd be great to bring Joe into our CISO Executive Certificate program and share some of those insights with our aspiring CISOs in that program.
Get him a cap and gown. Would be good to go.
Joe, I wanted to go back. You had a really nice post about this and talking about how much this really impacts a lot of the progress that we had been seeing recently. There's just been so much great activity, and an openness and a collaboration with DHS and CISA and other organizations. It felt like we were making really good progress the last couple of years, and this really has the possibility of undermining some of that.
Yeah, another reason this case is such a kick in the gut to the security leaders in the private sector is because most of them did and do love the job, because it's very mission oriented. You're fighting the bad guys. You come to work every day protecting people. You represent your customers of your company and you fight to keep them safe. That's why everybody does it. They love the mission. That why so many people who are ex-government are in doing security inside companies. It's the only place inside a corporate environment where you are fighting the bad guys. But we can't win against the bad guys by ourselves in the private sector, and the government can't win in fighting the bad guys without the private sector. That's the reality of the internet that's different from every other. We expect government to protect us as citizens everywhere in the world, and that came out of most of those contexts. The government has 100% control, visibility, access. You talk about borders, but on the internet, it's all run in the servers of private companies. And if the goal is to get everybody working better together, actions like this are not helping, because it's not going to be a good, healthy transparency. It's going to be a CYA transparency that's not going to, it's like we're not feeling like we're on the same team anymore. But I want to throw a curveball at you guys. If let's imagine for a second we're in the shoes of the SEC. I think that government enforcement agencies feel the need to do something about internet crime and all this stuff, and they unfortunately Congress hasn't acted. There's no federal data breach law, even though it's been discussed a million times, and I think partially it's because our companies have blocked it, because a lot of the big companies don't want regulation. I think CISOs want regulation. They want really clear lines, but CISOs don't have a voice in that conversation. There's not a sitting CISO who can go to Congress and say, I want more regulation, because their company will fire them. And so it's us ex-CISOs who are the only ones who can speak up. And I think we want more regulation. We want more clarity out of Congress. But in the absence of that, we have these enforcement authorities who are looking and saying, I can fix this. But they're using inexact tools. I think I said, they're bringing a bazooka to a knife fight because that's the tool that they have. That's the SEC. They have one tool, right? They can go after companies for their statements if they don't like those statements, and so they're going to keep doing that. It's weird. It shouldn't be. Is that the right way to get companies to invest more in security? Is that the right agency to be doing it? I don't know. I would prefer that.
No, that's not a curveball. I mean, let's take your sentence there. Government feeling like we must do something. Now let's think back in history. How does that usually turn out? It's like, I'm not quite sure what to do, but we got to do something. And then let's go to our history class and think back. Are there a lot of cases where that works out, or does that usually lead to some colossal mistake? Usually leads to mistakes when it's, I don't know what to do, but I got to do something.
Well, it's especially if it's an agency that's not funded and full of people who are experts in this area. I think one of you referenced CISA earlier. CISA has done a great job of building partnerships with the private sector, hiring people from the private sector. They actually understand the challenges of CISOs. Like every security conference I go to, I see people from CISA there in the hallways, talking to practitioners, understanding their pain, asking, what can we put out that will help you? Like they're a small and growing agency, but DHS is backing them, and they're partnering with the private sector, and we get better security.
It's critical, Joe, that we remember CISA is not an enforcement agency. They deliberately decided not to be an enforcement agency in order to foster the exact kind of partnership that you're talking about, that you see. And I think that's critical. People. If I were advising a CISO, I would say don't ask for more regulation, because the way that regulation is going to pan out is not going to give you the warm and fuzzies. You're never going to get regulation or a law that says, Joel, do the following 17 things and you're safe. That's not the way that's going to work, right? It's always going to end up being something that is dealt with in hindsight, the way this is being dealt with in hindsight, right? And it's effectively diminishing the notion that, you know, if you that this risk management function ought to be left to the designs of experts within the company to deal with. I do think it's important, as you do, Joe. I think you implicit in what you said is to look at the other side of this from the SEC's perspective, or any government agency's perspective. They all want to be in cyber because otherwise they're not relevant, right?
Mhm.
That there has to be, there's a perception that companies ought to be spending more on cybersecurity. Okay, there's that perception. How do you get companies to spend more on cybersecurity? There are two general ways. One is you could give them you could play with their taxes. You know, if they spent more on cybersecurity, they got a credit or something on their taxes. That might be valuable. That usually is the way we incent things in our country, is to screw with the tax structure, and that's the way we incent things.
Or we
The
could
other
give
way,
immunity. Sorry, we could give immunity for quick reporting by companies.
well, quick reporting, that would be another way of doing it, right? Anything that you want, you can bring it on by things like taxes, immunity, safe harbors. You know, the plaintiffs' lawyers hate them. The administrative agencies hate them, because here in particular, just think of what that safe harbor rule would be. Joe, you undertake reasonable cybersecurity practices in your company, we'll give you a safe harbor. That's great until the shit hits the fan. Oh, sorry, still the stuff hits the fan, and we're going to have a big argument about what reasonable is. Ed told me not to curse. What a big, what a,
I'm allowed to curse. This is cable TV. It's fine.
you know, what's reasonable? And here, through the back door of materiality, they're essentially doing the same thing, right? They're deciding that certain things that SolarWinds didn't do, they should have reported because they were material. And essentially has turned that word into a substantive cybersecurity standard on an ad hoc basis, right? It's like you had SolarWinds 123 as a password. That was material.
Every company has a version of that, and so that's the circle of this conversation. We're back to the beginning again. Randy, I guess the ultimate question is what's the definition of materiality in this context, and are we ever going to get more clarity?
I think that the SEC was clear. I don't know that I agree. I mean, it creates these odd scenarios. For example, Community Bank Acme has, I don't know, $100 million in revenue, and they have a breach that's a $10 million breach, which is 10% of their revenue. By any reasonable interpretation, that's material. So they're in the process of figuring out what to do. But suddenly Community Bank gets bought by Wells Fargo, which makes $200 billion. Now suddenly the $100 million is just a little blip. The $10 million thing is like change that fell out of your pocket. It's not material anymore. So they're very clear that it's about investors, not about operational. Joe, you, Randy, and I, we would say it's the same breach, same impact, same problem, same community bank structure. But if they're in the context of a larger company, now for investors, it's not material. That's why as operators, we look at it and you can't help but roll your eyes. You say, this is voodoo economics we're dealing with here. So I think they were clear. I just don't think it's reasonable. I think that I sort of, I understand, Randy, where you're going with God. Don't be careful what you ask for with regulations. But there are some things that could be crafted that would be sensible. I've always felt that instead of saying you need to spend more, I think you need to be investing in young people coming into your program. Like we should have a legitimate cybercore program, and you can incent people to look. I want to see that you're hiring 5 young people right out of graduate school or out of undergrad with computer science degrees into your program. And if you do that, here are the good things that happen, and you need to show that you're cycling that every year, that you're bringing fresh blood in. That act alone, I think, without anything else, is going to improve 90% of the programs that I've seen. Just bringing some fresh blood, some new perspective, some, perhaps a little bit more engaged folks coming in right out of school. They have a lot of ideas, a lot of different creative solutions to problems. Little things like that, like, CISO would be behind that. They love it, but they don't have the power to do it. And that's where I think you can come up with sensible legislation that helps everybody. It's just going after the CISO. That ain't the way to go. That leads to, like I said, just I think a real problem.
Yeah, there's an argument to be made that we want to see those young people as they grow in their careers experience both the government side of it and the private
Yeah.
sector. Like I was a federal prosecutor, and I always thought that the legal profession had done it's just set up well for people getting out of law school, going and doing a clerkship and getting a little taste of government, and then you go in the private sector, and then if you want to get that trial experience, you go back into the government, and so there's just a lot of, in that profession, opportunity, and a lot of people in the private sector who used to be in government, a lot of people in government who used to be in the private sector, so they actually speak the same languages and they understand each other, and they empathize for the other position because they think I might be over that side someday, and so that's a kind of good thing. I don't feel like we have that back and forth between the private sector and the government on security, because
It's
I mean, in fact,
compensation. And it's true, and also in the legal profession. But you leave a job at DHS and go to a large bank, you go up 10x in your number, possibly. I mean, that's a lot. I remember, I won't embarrass by saying the name, but there was an administrator at DHS. I remember bumping into him at Union Station, and we were just taking a train. He just left government, went to private sector. I'm like, dude, nice to see you. Congratulations. He said, hey, you're making some money now. And I think he said something like 20x.
yeah.
I think it's gotten a little better over the last couple of years, but nowhere near the same level.
You can get that. It creates a weird dynamic going back and forth. Because I know for me in my career, when I left AT&T, I had an opportunity. I was talking to Dick Clark and some others about maybe going into government. And the discussion with my wife is, hey, listen, we're going to be eating peas out of cans for a couple of years, because I was making a little bit more money than that at AT&T. As it turned out, that was 2016. Things didn't go the way I thought they would go that year. But nevertheless, maybe that's good. And I didn't go, into government, and that would have been a sacrifice. You divest yourself of any kind of equity, and you'll make 120 grand, which may sound like a lot, but if you're making more than that, it's not much money. So
I think, Joe, that I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt, but I think that the paradigm you've set out there about going back and forth hopefully will increase, and it might be the only good aspect of the increase in regulation and beatings that the government is having. Companies will quickly realize that having someone who's spent some time in the government delivering the beatings is now something that they're interested in having in-house, right? And that will, once you have that sort of flow, and you have the increase in the number of jobs in the government related to cyber, there's places for them to go back to at a more senior level, then come back out. Hopefully that interchange will occur. I think you have a great idea, and as I said, it might be the only positive aspect to the beatings will continue until cybersecurity improves mentality that we have.
Yeah, I think the reason I think in the legal profession, so many of those people go back and forth is because when they go into the government, they get incredible experience that is valuable in the private sector. And so they can take a leap in their private sector career by giving some years to the government. And I think we need that in cybersecurity.
Yeah. So I think we could cover a million more topics. There's a lot to unpack on this issue, but we're running a little close on time here. So why don't I just do a quick roundtable? If there's any final thought or topic that we didn't get to that you want to make sure we get out there, now is a good time to do it. Randy, maybe I can start with you.
I think we've covered most of it. I would simply add that, to my CISO friends, that they've got to stay strong. This storm there'll be some changes from this, but the changes we don't need are not communicating with people, not encouraging communication up through your chain and not communicating from you up the ladder as well. That is, if that happens, that's a real big problem. I think that from a longer term, we really need to adopt a safety culture about this, and safety cultures don't beat up people who report, and they don't make examples of them. That's not a safety culture. That's sort of a retributive culture. So if we could come up with some ways to incent better behavior, that'd be great, but kicking people is not going to get us there.
If anything good comes out of this, it will be that the rest of the executive teams at these companies will be taking notice and hopefully helping the CISO prioritize the work. What we don't want is good people to not want to go into this profession out of fear. And so that's something I worry about. I've seen some good people step down from CISO roles and say, wow, I have like 100 pounds lifted off my shoulders all of a sudden. I remember last October when I stepped down from Cloudflare's CSO role, and it just felt like, that next morning I woke up and I'm like, I don't have the weight of 20% of the internet like getting hacked because of me on my shoulders anymore. And it just felt like liberating. And I was worried about just doing my job, the protective side, not worried about so much about like an enforcement action coming against me. It's just, the job is really hard as it is. Because we're the only people in the executive and business world who have adversaries on the other side. Intentional, active, smart, funded adversaries. Nobody else in business has to worry about that.
Joel, my only comment here is I don't think the SEC is going to change their mind. They're not going to back down. They're probably going to turn this up. So my advice to anybody who's a practitioner is to develop the language in advance, build automation, and work it into your workflow. Simple as that. And then once you've done that, you can just do your work. I think that is something we're all good at. I think it meets the letter of the law. I think it probably is a little passive aggressive, but it is what it is. It really does match up with the sensibility of the language that's being thrown at us. And that would be the advice that I'd give any team. Use automation, do it right, do it with the lawyers. It should be substantive things that you're reporting. But if they say we've got a vulnerability condition, something needs to be reported, could be material. I've been predicting that that's where this is going, and I think it's sensible for someone to start moving in that direction. I don't mean that to go after, say, the SEC or anything. I just think if you want the data, that's what's going to happen. We're going to automate, especially with that 4-day requirement. So it'll be interesting to watch the volumes. My prediction, the over-under on that is the volumes are going to go up.
Sure.
I'll take a turn as well if I can. Optimistically, I hope this leads to some better board oversight conversations and level of cybersecurity understanding and discussion at that level. On the negative side, I live in fear of, if this is what we're doing around cybersecurity, what are we going to do around emerging tech like artificial intelligence and quantum and the other things that are coming down the pipeline that we're, like, I just really fearful for the approaches they're going to try to take on those new emerging technologies. But we'll keep this conversation focused on cyber tonight. Well, listen, I really appreciate the conversation. I want to thank our panelists, Joe, Randy, Ed, fantastic insights, really appreciate it. I want to thank our NYU Center for Cybersecurity and Tag Cyber for sponsoring the discussion. And to everyone out there, just stay tuned. There's a lot more to come on this really challenging landscape that we're all going to have to navigate together. So looking forward to part 2 of the conversation.
Thank you all.